Okay, back to being stressed out. So here is what the Democratic Party is doing about anti-Semitism. The answer is nothing. Nothing. Members involved, this is according to the Daily Beast, members involved in crafting the resolution have already been hit with requests from the offices of Democratic lawmakers for specific groups to be included in the resolution. So now they're just going to broaden out what was a single issue resolution to include hatred against people of all faiths and all kinds. Now, I'm old enough to remember when the Black Lives Matter movement said Black Lives Matter, and people said all lives matter. It's not just black lives. Now, the left immediately interpreted that to mean that if you said all lives matter, you were seeking to obscure the fact that black lives matter. Those exact same people are saying today that if you broaden out an anti-Semitism resolution, specifically based on a specific circumstance to include all hatred, that's not watering anything down. It's amazing how that works. By the way, I will mention that when it comes to the Black Lives Matter, all lives matter distinction, the reason people said all lives matter is because they rejected the fundamental premise that black people were being unfairly targeted by the police across the country. That's what the actual argument was about. There is no argument that anti-Semitism exists, and there is no rational argument that Ilhan Omar is a purveyor of anti-Semitism. So this isn't even like the Black Lives Matter, all lives matter debate, because there is no good faith reason to broaden this thing out except to obscure Ilhan Omar's participation in anti-Semitism. But that's what the Democrats are seeking to do. In a second, I'm going to explain more of what they are doing. Representative Tulsi Gabbard, who is Hindu, reached out to top Democrats to ask that Hindus be specifically mentioned in the resolution. Other members have suggested Catholics, Muslims, and all forms of racism should be added too. Pelosi then replied, "What's too broad about fighting hatred wherever it exists?" Well, first of all, you're not fighting hatred where it exists. Your representative sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. You have said that she is not anti-Semitic and that she did not participate in anti-Semitism, Representative Pelosi. Pelosi was specifically asked about this. She said she didn't think that Ilhan Omar's comments were intentionally anti-Semitic. What in the hell does that even mean? Intentionally anti-Semitic. What? She was walking along the street, she slipped in a puddle, and boom, she started spouting anti-Jew hatred? I know it happens to me all the time, just walking down the street. Anvil falls on my head, and suddenly I'm shouting about the KKK being great. Ilhan Omar does this stuff every 2 weeks. She can't help herself. Intentionally anti-Semitic. By Wednesday afternoon, several of the Democrats had taken to blaming the media for covering Omar's remarks, claiming that racist and anti-Semitic actions and language from Republicans were being ignored. "We have to do better across the board," said Representative Max Rose. Now, this is peak whataboutism. Peak whataboutism. We can't condemn Ilhan Omar. We won't condemn Ilhan Omar because over there's a person. Go get him. Okay, now, let's be straight about this. The attempt to equate Ilhan Omar's comments with, for example, Representative Jim Jordan tweeting out Tom Steyer with a $sign in Tom Steyer's name is absurd. Tom Steyer isn't Jewish. He's Episcopalian. Also, to say that a particular person gives a lot of money to politics, say George Soros, is not anti-Semitic. To say that the Jews writ large are controlling American politics on behalf of Israel, that's anti-Semitic. George Soros does give a lot of money to politics. It's not anti-Semitic to point that out any more than it would be anti-Semitic for someone to point out that I speak on politics every day, because I do. That's a reality. That is not the same thing as saying Ben Shapiro and all the Jews are paying people off with their Jew money to support Israel. That's anti-Semitic. But look, the Democrats are not, the intellectual dishonesty, the willingness to overlook all of this, to pander to their intersectional new faces, it's astonishing. It's astonishing. Let's be real. The real reason the New York Times didn't cover the hate crime uptick in New York City is because the purveyors were largely from minority groups, statistically speaking. They weren't going to cover that. They weren't going to cover that because for the Democrats, not all hatred is to be condemned, only hatred that affects the intersectional coalition. Only hatred that helps them coalesce their various bands of supposedly dispossessed victim groups. And Jews aren't to be included in that, even though they are the smallest of these victim groups and the most likely to be targeted by hate crimes, because that might divide the Democratic base. Intersectionality is a dangerous drug. Democrats have been taking it, and now they've OD'd. Representative John Yarmouth said, "We've already voted on it." He said, "Whatever we do, it's going to look like we're responding specifically to her and to AIPAC." Well, it should look like you're responding specifically to Ilhan Omar. She's the one who started this. Majority Whip James Clyburn conceded some members felt Omar had been singled out for her comments. He said, all hate, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, all that stuff. And then James Clyburn let the cat out of the bag. Then James Clyburn really let the cat out of the bag. You ready for the ugliest garbage you've ever heard from Majority Whip James Clyburn of South Carolina. You ready for this? This is from The Hill. Clyburn came to Omar's defense on Wednesday, lamenting that many of the media reports surrounding the recent controversy have omitted mentioning that Omar, who was born in Somalia, had to flee the country to escape violence and spent 4 years in a Kenyan refugee camp before coming to the United States. Her experience, Clyburn argued, is much more empirical and powerful than that of people who are generations removed from the Holocaust, Japanese internment camps during World War II, and then the other violent episodes that have marked history. I'm serious about that. There are people who tell me, well, my parents are Holocaust survivors. My parents did this. It's more personal with her, Clyburn said. I've talked to her, and I can tell you, she is living through a lot of pain. This is vile. Vile. So anti-Semitism no longer matters because you see Ilhan Omar suffered. You know who else suffered? Ayaan Hirsi Ali. You know what the left has done with Ayaan Hirsi Ali? They've othered her. They've decided that she cannot be heard. They've tried to ban her from campuses because she is anti-radical Islam. They've done that. She had the same worse experiences than Ilhan Omar. I'm not aware that Ilhan Omar was a victim of female genital mutilation as Ayaan Hirsi Ali was. Doesn't matter. Ayaan Hirsi Ali has been ousted by the Democrats and othered by the Democrats. But don't worry. Ilhan Omar can be as anti-Semitic as she wants to because who cares about the Holocaust? It happened so long ago. Now imagine for a second a Republican saying about the history of slavery. You know what? People should stop complaining that America enslaved people. They really should stop complaining about it altogether. Like, we shouldn't even mention it. And if somebody says something racist today, that is linked to the legacy of slavery. If somebody says something about enslaving black people today, that is linked to the legacy of slavery. We shouldn't, that was 150 years ago. Were you enslaved? Happened a long time ago. People on the left would be angry to suggest that because you had people who died in the Holocaust, well, you haven't suffered as, what is this, competitive suffering? This isn't about who has suffered more. This is about a person expressing open Jew hatred and James Clyburn making excuses for it because he wants to kiss Ilhan Omar's ass and the asses of all of her friends, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ro Khanna. This is James Clyburn kowtowing. And it's also about an unfortunate fact. The Congressional Black Caucus has tolerated anti-Semitism for years. They've been close with Louis Farrakhan. They've been close with a bunch of figures, Linda Sarsour. They've gone out of their way to cultivate relationships with people who have been ousted from the Overton window of American politics for decades now. The CBC coming out in defense of Ilhan Omar is just the latest iteration of this garbage. James Clyburn, really? We can't, my parents are Holocaust survivors? Listen, if the Holocaust had never taken place, you know it would still be wrong? Jew hatred. That would still be wrong. But for the Democrats, there is this intersectional pyramid. Ilhan Omar is higher on the intersectional pyramid. She's from Somalia, she's Muslim, she's a woman. That means she can be as anti-Semitic and disgusting as she wants to be. It's not just James Clyburn who is presenting pretty much openly anti-Semitic arguments at this point. I mean, Clyburn's argument is an openly anti-Semitic one. Anti-Semitism is fine, Jew hatred is fine, so long as you can say you're a member of a more victimized group or you have had more victimized experiences. But that's not the only terrible argument coming from the Democrats today. Every major Democratic presidential candidate who has commented on this has come out now in defense of Ilhan Omar in the most dishonest possible way. So Bernie Sanders, now people will say that Bernie Sanders, because he's a Jew, that he has more legitimacy on this. Bullcrap. Bernie Sanders has no more legitimacy on this than anyone else. He is not a practicing Jew. He has not been for a long time. He is an atheist. He has self-stated he's an atheist. He has no real identification with a shul, with the Jewish community, with Jewish principles, or any of that stuff. So spare me he can't be saying things in defense of anti-Semitism. He's a Jew. Of course he can. So here's him defending anti-Semitism from Ilhan Omar. Quote, "Anti-Semitism is a hateful and dangerous ideology, which must be vigorously opposed in the United States and around the world. We must not, however, equate anti-Semitism with legitimate criticism of the right-wing Netanyahu government in Israel." Hey, no one has done that. No one. Again, not a comment Ilhan Omar is being criticized for has anything to do with Benjamin Netanyahu. Not one word that she has said has anything to do with Israeli policy. It all has to do with the powers of the nefarious Jews and their dual loyalty. That is what she is being ripped for. If it were just about opposing Israel, then don't you think that every Democrat would be hit with this kind of stuff? Legitimately, like all of them? Because how many Democrats stood up against Barack Obama's insane Iran deal that put the existence of the Jewish state at risk? Virtually none. Was Chuck Schumer called an anti-Semite for that? No, he was not. So there was something different that happened here, obviously. But Bernie Sanders is playing this game. They're playing the sick, disgusting game where they say, Anti-Israel is not the same as anti-Semitism. Here is a person saying a very anti-Semitic thing, and we will pretend it is an anti-Israel thing. You ever wonder why so many Jews seem to get very touchy when people start talking about how much they hate Israel and how much they think that Israel is the evildoer in the Middle East? And you say, why are they so touchy? And I'm not touchy when they criticize my American party. The answer is because a lot of Jews look at your commentary on Israel, in which you incessantly criticize Israel, and they say, you might be an anti-Semite. And you say, well, I'm not. Okay, well, maybe you're not. But it's weird because all of the anti-Semites, all of them are anti-Israel. How odd. How odd. And not only that, all of the anti-Semites will guise their anti-Semitism under the, oh, I'm just anti-Israel canard. And Bernie Sanders is doing that today. He says, rather, we must develop an even-handed Middle East policy which brings Israelis and Palestinians together for a lasting peace. What I fear is going on in the House now is an effort to target Congresswoman Omar as a way of stifling that debate. F you, Bernie Sanders. Honest to God. What I fear is an effort to target Omar to stifle the debate. What debate? There's no debate. She didn't mean to start a debate about the power of AIPAC, about whether AIPAC's lobbying power is outsized, which, for the record, it is not. AIPAC spends less money on elections than virtually every other group that is connected with the promotion of connections with a foreign country. Right? There is a Cuba, there's a Cuban lobby, there is a Mexican lobby, there is, in fact, an Irish lobby. All these lobbies exist. But for the record, that's not what she's talking about. There is no debate here. She wasn't trying to start a debate. She was saying Jew-hating things, and Bernie Sanders is trying to subsume that under the rubric, oh, she's just anti-Israel, that's all. And this has become the talking point for the Democrats. So what they want to say is anti-Israel doesn't mean anti-Semitic. But if you say something anti-Semitic, we'll let it go because it's probably just anti-Israel. Senator Elizabeth Warren does the same thing. She says, we have a moral duty to combat hateful ideologies in our own country and around the world. And that includes both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Again, the fact that they feel the need to link the two, as though the real story here is people being mean to Ilhan Omar. The real story is a West Virginia GOP poster condemned by pretty much everyone. That is somehow equivalent to a sitting member of Congress consistently, not once, 3 times in 6 weeks, saying openly anti-Semitic stuff and not being condemned by her own party, equating the two. Okay, but that's not all. She says, in a democracy, we can and should have an open, respectful debate about the Middle East that focuses on policy. Branding criticism of Israel as automatically anti-Semitic has a chilling effect on our public discourse. Threats of violence like those made against Representative Omar are never acceptable. Who's making threats of violence against Ilhan Omar? And if they are, shouldn't they be arrested? That's a violation of the law. But notice how she conflates that. Again, for the 1 millionth time this show, I'm not saying, and no one has said, that all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. I am saying that if you use anti-Semitism and then cover for it by saying, no, I'm just being anti-Israel, then you are an anti-Semite and an anti-Semite enabler. Kamala Harris does the same thing. She's even worse, Kamala Harris. Garbage senator from California. She says, we all have a responsibility to speak out against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, racism, blah, 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 blah. But like some of my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus, I am concerned that the spotlight being put on Congresswoman Omar may put her at risk. What? So she says something wildly anti-Semitic, not once, 3 times. If we pay attention to this, we are the bad people because we are putting her at risk. I don't remember her same concern for Steve King's safety, do you? Representative King, who defended quasi-white nationalism. You remember this? He did this in the New York Times. Some of us called on people to support a primary effort from Senator Randy Feenstra in Iowa, who you should go support today. Some of us called on the House to censure Steve King and remove him from committee assignments. I'm old enough to remember that because I'm more than 2 months old. But apparently, Democrats are not old enough to remember that. They are very concerned about Congresswoman Omar's safety because people might say things that remind people of what she said. Unbelievable. And then there's Congressperson Emmanuel Cleaver. He says, I think there ought to be a resolution that ought to be condemning all the isms. If we're going to start condemning, let's condemn sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, everything. Oh, all lives matter. That's where we're going. All lives matter. By the way, the CBC was so defensive of Ilhan Omar that when she tried to escape questions yesterday, they literally formed an offensive line and pushed away journalists. Were the journalists angry? No, of course not. Were they upset? No, of course not. Today, all of the major newspapers in the United States are filled with editorials supporting Ilhan Omar and suggesting that the blowback on her is really about conservatives pouncing. It's really about the pouncing of the conservatives. Now listen, we know where all of this is going. Okay, this is not a shock. We know where all of this is going in Europe. And I'm going to explain where it has gone in Europe in just 1 second.